And I guess I know a bit about how much of an avid trans historian you are, Zackary. So I assume that I'm just curious, how long have you known about Liz and how long have you wanted to make this story?
I got a call from Jay in the spring of 2019 about Liz Carmichael and the Dale, and it was the first I'd ever heard of the story, which was it was surprising. I was surprised.
Every trans person in history.
I was surprised I've never heard of her, honestly, and I wonder sometimes if the claim that she was a man masquerading as a woman to commit fraud was so persistent that even trans people didn't know that she lived as a trans woman. I mean, it would be so easy to come to that conclusion if you only knew about her from Unsolved Mysteries or from the kind of few representations of her that existed. And
literally every piece of media at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
How did you hear about them, Jay? I'm just trying to get the origin story of
Nick Cammilleri, who is Zackary's co-director, has been working on this for almost 10 years, has been weirdly possessed by the story, brought it to us with a couple of producers, and we also had not heard of her. And the first reaction was somewhat like, is this even real? Like, there's so much going on here. How is it possible, that we hadn't heard of her, and then that Zackary hadn't heard of her, because, that was part of the impetus to bring Zackary along, not only as like a trans historian, but someone who could situate this story appropriately, culturally, help us move the culture forward. And also Zackary's like deep fine arts background. I mean, so many reasons why Zackary is so perfect for this.
So the animated piece, was that Nick's doing as well? Was that already in place, or was that something that you all decided?
No, Nick really kind of doggedly pursued this story for the better part of a decade. I believe 2011 was when he started to follow the breadcrumb trail, Liz's breadcrumb trail. And, he got the project of Duplass. Nick and I teamed up for the interviews. We reshot most of the interviews that he'd done over the years in 2019 and early 2020. And I took the helm in post to find the story, basically, with this incredible archive that Nick had amassed over a decade. So he had procured FBI files that were just mired in bureaucracy. For years he had been like pushing. He had, met collectors who own the remaining Dales. He had found the engineers, the jurors, the family, and basically put all of the kind of tools and source materials at our fingertips to craft a story. And the animation was a pivot due to COVID. We had to figure out how to tell the story from our home offices without shooting any extra material. And it was a serendipitous kind of divine intervention, I would say.
It's great. I mean, the very first story that the sort of old friend is telling is just so funny. It's just a funny way, it's like, and then he said, da-da-da, and little head.
The house. Yeah, no, they were not poor.
Oh, down. Like, it's just funny, yeah.
Yeah, I think the initial, we were initially talking about doing recreations, but shout out to Awesome and Modest who did our animation. Like, what we started to figure out along the way is that we needed to bring Liz back alive, because her history had been erased, as many trans people's histories are erased. And the thing that we started to figure out with the animation is that we could really like bring Liz's personality alive, like just how charismatic, how fun she was, how dynamic she was, which is really hard to do in a silhouette, for instance, like in a recreation. So yeah, we're feeling so grateful. It's hard to imagine it without the animation now. Honestly, it just feels like it's like I don't know, Zackary and Nick talk a lot about Liz sort of haunting them and telling her own story through them, and the animation absolutely feels like the icing on the cake of like Liz reincarnated back in this world.
Yeah, it's like Liz's space of boundless imagination, basically. It's like the, you know, amorphous world where anything can happen. We thought about it as like Liz animating her story, just like jagged edges, all like paper-based, it's analog, everything is kind of a jagged edge, basically. And it's like a ransom note or something. It's like cut out from magazines and newspapers and
right. So I'm curious, when you say you really started carving it in post and Nick had all this material, where did you start? What were sort of the themes I mean, it really is, there's a lot going on and you crafted so well. How did you think about it, that carving process, as you said?
I would say, I mean, the first challenge was, how do you tell the first 45 years of Liz's life with FBI files? And so animation was very, you know, we realized very quickly that it could create a multi-dimensional kind of layered complexity of Liz's life. And it was, I think the big quandary was like, Liz was very well documented in those 2 short years of her life, 1974, 75, as she's promoting the Dale and her epic downfall. And outside of that, there was very little. So the first and last episode, we had to create a story out of very little source material. Yeah. And then, of course, in the first episode, there's a lot of archival too, you know, obscure kind of film.
Yes, I love that. Can you talk about that a bit? I recognize one of the early films of the black and white with the black woman. I forget where
Behind Every Good Man.
Yes,
I think, and that's the film from the 60s. I mean, it's like one of the earliest, you know, short films that I've seen from Los Angeles. We wanted to create a portrait of trans life in the 60s to situate Liz in. I mean, Liz was a satellite, like so many other folks in her generation. There was no recognizable community for her to be a part of. Flawless Sabrina, my chosen grandmother, always called it an anti-community, that it was actually like, that people were such satellites that it was an actual anti-community, that there was like no way to really kind of come together. Or even if you did, people were so at odds with themselves that they could not be aligned with each other.
But so there's that film. Is there other archival, like early trans films in there that you use?
There's a bunch. Yeah, there's Queens at Heart. There is kind of raw news coverage from Dick Carlson, shot in the Tenderloin in the 1960s, which is primarily sex workers, and it includes one trans woman. So that became an interesting component, because we actually used that in the first episode. It's a trans woman talking about employment discrimination, and she's gone to numerous firms, and they've said, we don't want to hire anyone of your caliber.
I've approached numerous firms asking them for any kind of work that they had to offer over a period of 8 months. The same response: we can't hire anybody of your caliber. We don't want any of your people working for us. So what else was I supposed to do when you get damn hungry?
We didn't realize it as we were editing the first episode, but as we were making the second, I started poking around and I realized, I watched the rest of the footage and I realized that it was Dick Carlson. But it was, in fact, our suspicions that he would have been exposed to trans people because of his reporting in the Tenderloin turned out to be completely true. And we had empirical evidence of it. It was just wild. And then there's Pat Rocco's Changes, which features Jennifer, I'm forgetting her last name right now. She's walking down Hollywood Boulevard.
Yeah, I want to obviously we'll get to Dick Carlson. That is such a wild turn in the piece, but also just because you mentioned that there was so little about Liz. And then I'm also thinking of the reporter from Austin and how, you have to interview, basically your main source material is a lot, and the FBI, it's all these people who were misgendering her, had negative views of her. And it's just, it's just interesting how you reframe that. And then I'm imagining you in those interviews, and how much did you decide to include that was like maybe a little uncomfortable? Because there's moments when I'm watching that I'm like feeling for you in that room as the interviewer, and it's also just uncomfortable to watch on screen. But it's like these are the people that knew her story too, and they're your source material.
Yeah, I can tell you that there was like one interview in which I was actually crying behind the camera because I was like having a day already, and this subject, we didn't include any of this in the series, but just went on a transphobic tear, not even about Liz, but just about trans people. He basically, the gist of it was like, are we supposed to accept bestiality? Are we supposed to accept pedophilia? And he went on this long tirade, and it was out of left field. And we actually thought that he was a very sympathetic character up until that point. Out of just my own amusement, our editor put together like a transphobia reel, which we considered putting into the third episode because it was just so astounding, the things that people said on camera. And we were very sparing with it, truthfully, because we had to maintain good guys. We had to have, you know what I mean? It was like everybody had some kind of questionable thing to say about transness in general. And it was a fabulous learning experience for me. I think at the time was flabbergasted. And there was one point where I asked the crew, I was like, is this standard? Do people always talk this way about trans people? And it just opened up really interesting conversations. I learned a lot. I don't know. What do you think, Jay?
I was worried about you. I mean, we've had a lot of discussions about exactly what you were talking about, Jude, in terms of what are we going to allow people to say within our own documentary series, but that's also just yet another reason why we let Zackary lead and deputized her to lead, because, and this is really, what Zackary told me in the moment is like, well, we have to tell the truth, but, we try to ride a line between not shying away from the reality that it is. I mean, it's still stunning to me that 1990 in Austin, Texas was so brutal. I started college in 1991 in Austin, Texas, and it was the most liberal, open-minded place I had ever experienced in my entire life, by far. And to see that mainstream media was as brutal, if not more brutal, than things that were being represented in the 60s and 70s, it's pretty stunning. So, finding that right line of not shying away from the truth, but also not like overdoing it. I mean, we didn't want to trigger people, but I'm just proud of like where Zackary landed with it.
Yeah, it's really an amazing, it's an amazing archive. And I think as more, I've seen so many documentaries this year, sort of excavating trans history, and it's a hard thing to do. Like I saw the Pauli Murray doc at Sundance, and everyone's using different pronouns for them, but that's the story, right? That's what's interesting about it, is like they lived in, they were born in 1910. They didn't have any language for, so it's I think it's you walk the line really well. And even just in, who's using what pronouns at certain times, I can tell all of those choices are extremely thought through. I thought the brother-in-law was a really interesting character because he sort of he uses he, him when he's talking about their early days, and you're kind of like, oh, what's this guy going to go? And then as you see, he's like so supportive and sweet almost as soon as Liz comes out.
And Liz's daughter too, thank God for Candy. I mean, thank God for Candy's straightforward, like my dad, Jerry, became Aunt Jerry, became Liz, Aunt Liz, and then mother. Like that was just like, we needed that structurally just to establish like this person is Liz. Like these two people are the same person.
I mean, I think there is kind of a tendency, that I think like PC-ness can sort of blur the truths of someone's life, right? Mm-hmm. Like,
yes.
And it's, it's just so nice to see it well done, because it would be confusing otherwise. It would be confusing to trans people even if, we were only using feminine pronouns from the beginning of the story. It sort of erases
exactly
a lot of Liz's, identity, I guess.
Yeah, there's something so profound for me about the perspective of Candy, her daughter, and her brother-in-law, who have been with them and are in a loving relationship with them. There's something very, I don't know, Zackary, you talk about it this way. There's something very affirming about it. You talk about it in many ways, Zackary, in terms of like, this woman lived and these things unfolded, and they're held, they're seen and held by many people, but this document exists now, and Liz can't be denied. And the idea that the people who love her most and are closest to her help us get to deeper layers of truth, because there's not it's very hard to talk about it in a monolithic way, and whenever they speak, it's just there's something very profound and affirming about it to me. When I first started seeing those interviews, I was like, oh my God, this is what we needed.
The story of the grocery store, being a little kid in the grocery store, I thought was really, because
how
you ever, I don't know, you don't hear little tiny anecdotes like that, I think.
Yeah, that stuff. And then the way that I don't want to give away too much, but the way that it subconsciously pays off into Liz's fourth act, if you will, as like a matriarch, as like a very successful matriarch, in my opinion, someone who really was there for her family through it all and maintain that position of supporting her family and trying to, make everyone's dreams come alive, including homeless people on the outskirts of Austin, Texas.
Yeah, that is a wild. And she's also, I mean, she is a complicated moral and ethical figure in some ways, right? Not because of that piece, but you know, I watched it with my girlfriend, and she a little bit was like, there's kind of a Trumpian quality to her. Like, I'm just going to do it. Like the Dale was a bit of a, I mean, she
the
says
power of positive thinking,
right?
Which is essential to Trump's ethos. And Liz, I mean, the reverberations are deep. I mean, the 1970s produced both of them, like the cult of personality, the kind of tacit acceptance of narcissism that's become so pervasive today that it's endemic. I think that there's, parallels, and not only to Trump, but to entrepreneurs today who are also shaping society. There's definitely a parable in there, or an allegory in a way.
All right, I want to talk about Dick Carlson, because and we don't have to give too much away, but at what point did you realize, all right, we have to sort of, this guy is now kind of a character in this, and I mean, he's completely shaped. I mean, it's crazy, the montage when you trace it to Tucker Carlson, just how, I mean, this is the beginning of sort of the media's attack on trans people. And you trace it to this guy. It's like this whole sort of secondary storyline within her story.
I mean, it's certainly the latest chapter, Tucker Carlson, and learning that Liz was the trans boogeyman of Tucker Carlson's childhood, that, Tucker Carlson's heroic father was only afraid of one person, and it was a trans person, that in his imagination he got to kill. It's pretty dark. I mean, I don't even know what else there is to say about it, but it was a lot to sit with. I mean, to me, Dick Carlson is asking good questions in the second episode, and you're kind of waiting for somebody to hold Liz to account or to catch her on her bullshit. And he does so in the second episode, and you're not quite sure where it's heading or what's motivating him. And then I think when you do learn that, it discredits his journalism to some extent, because you realize how distorted it is by his own misogyny, his own hatred of women, and his own homophobia and transphobia. And it almost makes perfect sense when you see him in that trajectory of what he produced.
It also just got me thinking a lot about, why is Dick Carlson so obsessed with trans people? It's really overt and persistent over time, over people. It's really fascinating. That I spent a lot of time thinking about that.
Yeah. But I think a lot of people have always wondered, like, what is Tucker Carlson's deal? And just to have some explanation, some light shed on where that bias is from, and truly how deep-seated it is for him. It's astounding. Absolutely. And I feel like I know so much about both of them. I mean, in the research process, just reading articles, Dick Carlson told stories about himself as a young person in the media. He claimed to be the son of another Carlson who was an actor, who was like a silent film star. He was not, he was adopted. He had a kind of a tragic story as a child. Tucker Carlson, in the 1980s, assaulted a gay man for looking at him sideways in a public restroom. I think there's a lot of fragile masculinity in the Carlson family, for sure.
How many days of interviews were you with him, and what was that like?
Dick Carlson, Nick interviewed Dick Carlson earlier in 2016, and we had scheduled an interview in 2019, and he unfortunately canceled. So we used
I'm always curious he obviously didn't know Nick's angle, I guess, or when people who look horrible in documentaries say yes to things, what are they thinking?
That he's the hero of his own story. Yeah. And that Liz is essentially tertiary. I mean, she's essentially just a side character in Dick Carlson's narrative.
But also, just to be clear, in my experience, people may know your angle or where you're coming from, and they will still say horrible things to your face in a doc. It's pretty amazing. It makes me feel that, most people are unexpressed and want to be heard. So also when you have lovely people like Zackary Drucker behind the camera, you want to tell them things, and that's very real. That's very real. Top-notch human beings make great documentarians.
Interesting. Why is that?
Yeah, you have to be able to see things from all sides also, and hold space for so many different viewpoints.
I think people can feel when you are trying to trap them, which we never were, we're just trying to uncover truth, and there's something very pure about that. And there is something very important about having really, really good humans in the room when you're capturing something that is scary or, sensitive or whatever it may be.
Yeah. What can we take from Liz Carmichael's existence in the world? I mean, for me, I felt kind of an overwhelming sense of like, oh, we've been here. And look, 50 years ago, look what she did and what she was doing. I'm sure you have a more eloquent way of putting it, but I'm excited about the kind of next round of documentaries and films to like really dig into trans history. What do we get? Each of those pieces of the puzzle kind of like, puts a little more of our humanity in, we were there.
My little takeaway, Zackary, you should wrap it up because you're always the best. But my little takeaway is that the thing that I just have been seeing and feeling is like, who's more American than Liz Carmichael? Like who's braver and did what they had to do with all the odds stacked against them to fully express themselves and achieve the American dream. It's not perfect. We're not saying Liz is a good role model, but who's more American than Liz? It just, the more that I watch it, I feel it. I feel that feeling about her stronger and stronger.
I think that because we have stories in which trans people's lives are conveyed and represented in fair and authentic ways, we're able to tell stories about complicated trans protagonists. And it's the entire media landscape that has kind of made this story possible right now. So I always want to express gratitude for the many leaders in our community who are creating stories, putting their stories out there, and expanding our culture's notions of difference. I think that Liz's survival against all odds is inspiring, and it's sometimes staggering to really sit with what folks had to go through for us to be here today, for us to get to this particular point. I feel so strongly that stories about trans resilience are universally inspiring, that there's something for everybody to learn in them. And ultimately, nobody makes it out of life alive. Nobody makes it out of here unscathed. And I hope that it's a difficult life for gender diverse people. I hope that people can witness Liz's survival through into her 70s as a testament to our perseverance, and that young people, especially seeing this, learn, how strong their predecessors were.
You're right. She does good wrap up.
The best.
Well, it's so good. I'm so excited for more people to watch it, and I think it's just the perfect length and everything, and it's such an interesting story. Congratulations to you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your support.